Over the past few years, we have seen our Big Brother winners utilize their newfound fame to progress their careers to new heights they could have never imagined possible. Nicole Franzel has made a career out of her social media presence and has come back for another season of Big Brother as well as an appearance on The Amazing Race. Both Josh Martinez and Casey Clark have made their careers on The Challenge and have become regulars on that show. Even Jackson Mickey has turned the spotlight towards making TikToks, and now has a ridiculous following, close to matching the amount of money he won on the show to begin with. But, if we go back a little further, we see something different. We see someone who dreamt of being on the show, was able to make it on, and then proceed to live out their dream by winning Big Brother. But afterwards, they took to themselves and continued on with life as if nothing had happened. His Big Brother story really seemed like it started and ended within the house, and to be honest with you all, it's incredibly refreshing to see someone who came in and could have had it all, but was there for the right reasons and not for the following. So today, we'll be looking into how this nerdy trombonist played a severely underrated winning game. This is the story of how Steve Moses won Big Brother 17.
Where's Steve?
Where is Steve?
Hey, what are you doing?
It's a good place to get away.
Yeah.
Not sure what this is.
Stephen Moses was a young 22-year-old college student from Governor, New York, who had a particular passion for music. A few years prior to competing, a slightly younger Stephen saw Ian Terry walk into the Big Brother 14 house, and he was not thrilled. Of course, he was happy to see Ian get the chance to play, but he knew that's the archetype he was going to try to become casted for when he was old enough to apply, and he was worried that his obvious physical similarities to Ian could cause others to group them together, and it was made even worse when Ian ended up winning. Stephen knew this was going to paint an early target on his back if he ever got onto the show, because they'd be worried about him being the next Ian. And sure enough, there were early talks of this happening when he walked into the Big Brother 17 house. To combat this, though, Stephen would try doing little things in order to differentiate himself from Ian in the hopes of lessening the comparison and getting rid of that early target. One specific thing that he did was change his name. Typically going by Stephen his whole life, he felt that sounded a bit too similar to Ian, so he started going by Steve in the house. I know it sounds like such a simple change that wouldn't do too much on a surface level, but it's kind of genius. Our brains tend to group things together based on how they sound, even if there is little relation between the two, regardless of whether we do it on purpose or not. By just taking out the similarity of pronunciation between his name and Ian's name, it starts a new narrative of Steve being his own player as opposed to being another Ian. Regardless, even if this is too simple of a change, it's important to realize that Steve was thinking of these little minute things that most others wouldn't think of, and we'll see more of this later.
Steve, you were on the chess team.
Steve!
I was not on the chess team.
Once we got into the Big Brother 17 house, Steve was doing an okay job of getting to know people, but made sure he was always taking time to himself to paint the picture that he was sort of a loner and that he was less threatening because of that. With the Battle of the Block twist coming back for this season, it definitely made things a bit scarier for Steve. The comparisons to Ian were already there whether he liked it or not. He didn't perform too well at the first HOH comp, which he wanted to throw, but still. And with 4 nominees each week, Steve was looking like a perfect pawn. Fellow houseguest Jace was making himself out to be a big threat early on, so HOH's James and Jason were planning on backdooring him, and James ultimately nominated Steve and Jackie as pawns. Steve had a shot to earn safety through the Battle of the Block competition, but was ultimately unsuccessful. Now, with the real nominations set, it wasn't looking too good at face value. No player who has ever been nominated in the first week has ever gone on to win the game, so to be nominated right off the bat couldn't have been the best feeling for the young superfan. But honestly, Steve knew he was chillin', as he was aware that Jace was the backdoor plan, so it didn't matter as long as Jace wasn't picked to play in the veto and then won. Luckily, Jace wasn't picked, and Steve felt good. That didn't stop him from going for the veto just in case, and he was successful, winning the first veto of the summer. After he used the veto to save himself, Jace went up in his place. Once Jace found out that Steve knew that this was going to happen, he awkwardly chewed Steve out in an attempt to make him feel bad, but Steve played his role perfectly, staying mostly quiet while allowing Jace to just blab out information that could potentially be useful to Steve in the future.
You were supposed to be my friend. You think these people are your friends? You think they care about you like I did? Do you?
After Jace was then evicted near unanimously, we head into week 2. Steve was in the mindset that he was going to throw any competition he didn't explicitly want to win, as to not show off any of his competition prowess until the endgame. He threw the HOH, and Shelly and Becky became the new HOHs instead. In this early game, Steve wanted to work with the Goblins, who were a group of players consisting of James, Jackie, Meg, Audrey, Davon, Jason, Jeff, and kinda Becky and Johnny Mac. Unfortunately, players like James and Davon weren't reciprocating Steve's enthusiasm to work together, which is what led to Steve working with the other side of things, which we'll get to later. Back to week 2, though, Steve was nominated once again, this time alongside Jason. Steve, once again, didn't feel in any danger, though, and he was able to win the Battle of the Block easily since his opposition, Johnny Mac, threw the competition. Therefore, Steve earned safety for the week, offering him some time to finally relax and work on his positioning in the house. Steve was picked to play in the week 2 veto, but threw it, as he didn't want to win the first 2 vetoes of the summer. That's a big target that Steve doesn't want on his back.
I need to pick Jason. I know if I pick Jason, Jason is going to bust his butt out here to try to win this veto and make sure I stay safe. Steve. I picked damn Steve.
Anyways, Johnny Mac won the veto and pulled himself off, and it was around this time that Davon then informed Steve that there was a twin in the house, and it was Liz. Not too pressing of a concern at this time, but still worth noting that he found out in week 2. After the week played out and Davon went home, Steve was able to start working on his non-threatening loner underdog strategy even more. Over the course of the next few weeks, Steve was sitting really good. Steve tried to win the week 3 HOH but failed, but it was pretty much a crapshoot, so not too much bad luck there. Vanessa and Austin won the competition and didn't target Steve. Around this time, I think it's important to mention this. There was a power alliance of Vanessa, Austin, Liz and Julia, and Shelly and Clay called the Sixth Sense, who were very much in control of the early game. But there was a secondary alliance formed around this time called Freaks and Geeks, which included the same people, except they swapped out Shelly and Clay for Steve. This was not shown on the show because the producers didn't feel like it was the real deal, and we have confirmation of this by the fact that weeks later, when production was realizing that this alliance was in fact legit, they had to tell the players to rename the alliance because CBS did not have the rights to have an alliance be named Freaks and Geeks, which informed those players that the alliance wasn't being shown on the show for weeks, and they changed their name to the Scamper Squad later on.
The Scamper Squad.
Myself, Liz, Julia, Vanessa, and Steve have loosely been working together for quite a while. We want to call ourselves the Scamper Squad.
So even though Steve was seemingly invisible during the pre-jury phase, he was actually in a really good spot. He was in a powerful alliance, but wasn't the figurehead or power player. So when the other side took a shot at the Freaks and Geeks, he would not be the one targeted. Steve was unaware of the alliance that included Shelly and Clay, but was sort of an outside member in that alliance anyways, sort of like a satellite. Back to week 3 though, Steve was able to have a pretty chill week as Jeff ended up going home, but it's worth noting that Steve did vote for Jeff to stay.
I vote to evict James.
I vote to evict James.
The next week was a pretty similar story. Steve was planning on throwing the HOH, but he just flat out got the first question wrong, which gave us a pretty funny DR session.
Oh, an idiot. I should have gotten the first question. I'm a complete idiot. I screwed up. Was I going through the HOH? Yes. Was that a throw? No.
And instead, Shelly and Liz became the new HOHs. Steve continued to lay low and was rewarded by not being nominated, and then having Audrey sent home near unanimously. In week 5, Vanessa was the HOH after Liz won the Battle of the Block, ensuring that Julia would enter the game as an individual player the following week. Steve's alliance almost started to turn on each other as Vanessa was very, very close to backdooring Austin, but she decided against it after Austin pitched to her and Jason went home instead. Another player on the Goblin side of the house who had just suffered 4 straight evictions in a row. Now, in week 6, I think that this week showcases just how nicely Steve was positioned. The Battle of the Block twist ended, so we were back to normal Big Brother. It was the first time we saw that the Goblins were able to come into sole power, with James winning HOH. After he went back on his word and nominated Shelly and Clay, it was like a super line drawn in the sand, with the Goblins versus the Sixth Sense / Freaks and Geeks / Scamper Squad, whatever.
I swear to you, they are like the ones that are running this.
They're coming after us for sure, and we need to throw down because they f***ed up last week. They f***ed up so bad.
I have nominated you, Clay, and you, Shelly, because there were some lines drawn in the sand last week. I was blindsided by that as well.
So everyone in this house can know right now that James is not good for his word. Clay and I had absolutely nothing to do with Jason going up on the block last week. And anyone who wants to come to us and find out the true story behind what happened, fair game.
This nomination.
Except, Steve was so well acclimated towards the bottom of his alliance, while also maintaining his lone wolf status by constantly hanging out by himself, that he was tricking everybody into thinking that he wasn't a threat at all. He was also forming strong bonds with individuals like Johnny Mac and Vanessa, making these under-the-radar duo pairings with them in the process. Steve wanted to be the guy that would be a waste of an HOH to get rid of, and someone that could always be taken out later. And we see that this is exactly true. Nobody was ever like, I see what's going on with Steve's game, we gotta take him out now. Nobody, because Steve managed his positioning perfectly. Steve had spent weeks building up his loner persona, which in turn displayed masterful levels of threat management, which is something that Steve does not get nearly enough credit for. By voting for Jeff to stay in Week 3, as well as showing that he wanted to work with people in the Goblins early on, he was maintaining good positioning on both sides of the house so that he was never going to be the real target by anyone on any given week, but not being looked at as a total coaster either. And outside of the game, Steve was making really strong personal connections with the other players, and his social game was genuinely really good. During this week, Shelly had to endure a 24-hour punishment, and Steve's plan was to sit out in the night with her as she did it, all night, which was a mixture of strategy he had thought of before going into the house, as well as just Steve being a genuinely good guy. Shelly wanted to just be with Clay though, and she told Steve that. But besides that, Shelly really liked Steve, and this displayed Steve's jury management starting up, even though we weren't technically at the jury stage just yet. It was good though, because Shelly ended up staying and Clay went home later that week, which brings us to the start of the jury phase at the final 11, which I'll consider the beginning of the mid-game.
Let me congratulate you. From here on out, every evicted house guest will be headed to the jury house.
At the start of the jury phase, we get Becky winning the Week 7 HOH, and she was dead set on backdooring Vanessa. Becky was very, very much wanting her out, and didn't like her too much either.
I can see right through Vanessa, and I'm done with her. I cannot stand her style of gameplay.
Does Becky even know that we're Big Brother? Like, what the? She doesn't want to talk about deals? Like, what?
But to do this, she had to nominate 2 pawns, and she chose Steve and Shelly. Although, once again, Steve felt safe, as he knew it was in nobody's best interest to get him out, and that there was a backdoor plan set in place. However, this nomination began the start of Steve wanting to target Becky, as she was constantly revealing Steve's entire game plan to the house, which Steve had done a really good job of keeping on the down low.
Steve, you are the biggest Big Brother fan ever, and I want to see you get your hands dirty. Get into the social game. Throw a target out there. Win a comp. Get a little dirty in that POV this week.
Yes, Becky, I'm aware I'm laying super low. Yes, Becky, I'm aware I have no blood on my hands. This has all been intentional. Thank you for pointing this out, and now that you're advertising you're aware of this, you're my next target.
Even though Steve knew he was pretty much safe regardless, he once again took his opportunity to guarantee it through the veto and was victorious, which means that up to this point, Steve had really only gunned for 1 HOH and 2 vetoes, and was victorious in both vetoes he tried for. Steve was very sneakily great at these comps, but was good at covering it up by doing bad in almost all the other ones. Steve then took himself off the block and Vanessa went up instead. Vanessa did an extremely good job while on the block though, and was somehow able to flip the target back to Shelly, surviving this backdoor attempt, and Shelly went home. Vanessa staying this week is very, very good for Steve's game, and we'll see that over the course of the rest of the game. What happens next is what Steve has said to be the best accident that happened to him in the entire game. It was double eviction night, and as usual, Steve was ready to throw the HOH comp because he was in such a good spot and had created this perfect perception of himself in the eyes of the other players. And showing his cards was most certainly not what he wanted to do. Except...
The correct answer is true. Congratulations, Steve. You are the new head of household.
Steve tried to throw the HOH in the end, but just kept getting the questions right and was eventually the last person remaining, crowning him the head of household. Initially, Steve was upset as he now had to show his cards and he didn't have any time to think about what to do. This was the worst case scenario at the moment. He didn't know if he should take the shot at Becky or potentially even at the twins, but he decided to put up Meg and Jackie, as Jackie was the only person Steve knew had potentially said his name as a target, and he knew nobody would vote out Meg. His plan worked, and Jackie was soon headed out the door. The reason that this accident turned out to be super beneficial towards Steve's game is that the twins and Austin were now 100% in Steve's corner for the time being. They were worried that Steve would possibly take the shot against them even though they were working together, because Steve had never done anything to prove where he actually stood, which was his plan. But through this, he really solidified his spot, and the Oz twins felt indebted to him and were ready to protect Steve moving forward. Steve also did a little bit of acting, but also a little bit of real crying with the twins and Vanessa in order to garner some sympathy and appear a bit weaker while also strengthening his game relationship with them all. And then on the flip side, Steve was able to go to the remaining goblins and turn it around on Vanessa by saying she was the one planting the seeds for Steve during the double eviction without actually even saying her name, which means that he was forgiven and once again good with that side of the house, while also painting a bigger target on Vanessa. And he strengthened his positioning with the Scamper Squad where they would further protect him, and he was able to take out Jackie, who was the only person possibly going after him at the time. And, although he didn't know it, he solidified Jackie's jury vote 100%. That's a lot of good stuff to come from the happy little accident. So, yes, even though you could say that this was a fluke because he tried to throw the HOH and failed, I think it's impressive that Steve was able to turn that around and massively improve his overall positioning in the house without increasing his target in the slightest. And he did it all within an hour. Not a lot of time to plan that out.
Answer is true. Congratulations, Steve. You are the new head of household.
I didn't want that HOH. I tried to throw it. I didn't know Jason had a collar. I did not want this head of household. I was in good shape. I was in really good shape. And everything I was doing with hanging out alone all the time just went down the tubes. I convinced both sides I was on their side, and I just completely and totally lost it and claimed sides. I want to throw up.
Steve. It's okay, Steve.
I'm ecstatic that Steve kept Liz and I safe during this double eviction. I know if one of us win this HOH, we have to keep him safe.
Listen, come on. It's gonna be okay. It's gonna be okay. You're gonna be okay, Steve. You're gonna be okay.
About 50% acting. Okay.
Was that coming from one person or multiple people?
If you had to guess, you'd probably be right.
Meg and Becky are telling me that there's no hard feelings and they're not mad at me and blaming essentially my entire HOH on Vanessa. I don't know why they're believing it, and that's great for me, or they are fantastic liars and I really respect their game.
So, after the double eviction, we get to the next week, and Liz wins the HOH, which really makes Steve feel a lot better about his decision during the double eviction, as he was now kept 100% safe this week. And even better, Becky was looking to be going home. Even though Steve was targeting Becky in general, the night before her eviction, Steve stayed up all night with her and talked, which is a testament once again to Steve's social game, as well as his jury management. He was making it so that these players heading out the door would be excited to vote for Steve at the end, as opposed to begrudgingly voting for him as it would be for someone like Vanessa, which we'll get to later. With Becky heading out the door, Steve was able to form another tight bond with himself, Johnny Mac, and the twins, which is just further insulating himself within the house dynamics as we move on through the mid-game.
This is the perfect time to jump on the Johnny Mac and Steve train. They know the game, they're pretty smart, they're fierce competitors, they're on the outside looking in, and they don't really have a team, so we're giving them the support they need.
Yeah, sure, I'm on board. You're awesome. You guys are geniuses. I wish I had thought of it. I did.
After Becky's eviction, a slight wrench in Steve's plan occurred at the final 8 when Austin won the HOH. While Meg and James were the clear targets, Austin figured it was best for his game to leave them in, and instead he put up Steve and Johnny Mac with a Vanessa backdoor option left open. Although at face value, it seems not great, Steve once again wasn't worried because he knew that he had all of his bases covered and that it just wouldn't be logical for the house to evict him. The backdoor plan was put in jeopardy, though, when Vanessa was picked to play in veto and won.
It's my birthday. It's my birthday. Oh, yeah.
Steve told Vanessa that he was happy she won the veto, but when Vanessa found out that Steve knew of the potential backdoor plan for Vanessa and was okay with it, she was very upset and called Steve out during the veto meeting and kept the nominations the same.
Who orchestrated it?
Not me.
It's you. And they told me it was you. It was all of them confirmed it was you, wasn't it? Was it you?
No.
Was it you?
No.
You could at least have the balls to admit it.
No.
What?
Wait, I'm sorry.
No. They wanted to get me out, and you were working with them. It was your idea to orchestrate the 5-person alliance to do it, wasn't it? No. I would be breathing heavy, too, if I were you. Goodbye.
Okay.
On paper, this doesn't seem good for Steve, but after a bit of time, Steve was able to have a conversation with Vanessa to smooth things over and ensure that things were back to being good. Although it definitely wasn't ideal for Steve to lose Johnny Mac, it was better than the alternative of himself going home, and Steve was easily able to get the votes to stay and became the first person to survive the block against Johnny Mac come eviction night, where nobody even voted against him. Before moving on to the next week, there's another aspect of Steve's game that I would like to bring up. Steve had long ago recognized how strong of a strategic and physical force that Vanessa was. Steve knew that eventually he was going to need to take her out if he wanted to win the game. But because he knew how powerful Vanessa was, he needed to make sure that Vanessa didn't unravel Steve's true game plan and evict him. In order to do this, Steve knew his best chance of Vanessa keeping him around would be to come across as if Vanessa owned him and that he was her little minion. He needed to convincingly trick Vanessa, one of the best poker players in the entire world, which is no easy task. He basically needs to bluff her out. So Steve started doing the little things. Steve hated having facial hair, but Vanessa told Steve she liked how he looked with it. So Steve kept it in order to push the narrative that she controlled him, even though he despised it. It's these little intricacies that convince me that Steve's game is a lot more impressive than what was shown to us. Steve knows he's fighting a losing battle if he were to try and go full force against Vanessa, so he's playing the only hand he knows he could possibly beat Vanessa with. There were plenty of times that Vanessa even started to have an idea that Steve might be working with others with the inevitable intent to get Vanessa out, but Steve was always able to smooth things over with Vanessa and convince her that he was in her corner.
I'm really frustrated Austin went back in our alliance, but I gotta give Vanessa credit. I don't know how she's working this magic, but as a superfan, I have to appreciate her gameplay, and she is good. Before the eviction, Vanessa and I were able to talk through our problems, and we made amends.
I want to apologize to you for hurting you.
Yeah.
I never wanted to cause you pain.
I can be a logical person and whatever, and do the best I can to forgive.
With this knowledge now, let's get back to the timeline. Back at the Final 7, we get a surprise. Johnny Mac is back, and we move back to the Final 8 once again. This time, Vanessa wins the HOH, and with Johnny Mac back in the house, it was a perfect time for a secret alliance to form between Vanessa, Johnny Mac, and Steve. Vanessa nominated Meg and James, but after James won the veto, Vanessa was put to the test to see if she would be loyal to this new group. She was, and she nominated Julia as her replacement nominee. With an opportunity to break up the twins, it looked like a tough decision, but ultimately Steve figured out that it would be better to send home both Meg and James first and to get to the final 6 with the Oz twins, which would ensure that there was still a massive boulder of a threat to go after at that point, who would also not target Steve, putting him in a prime endgame spot. Also, by sending Meg home, Steve was able to appease Vanessa and continue the narrative that she owns him, which is a big proponent that keeps Steve alive in the endgame. So, with Meg going home, we enter the second double eviction of the summer, and with James the odd man out, he was sent out right after Meg. And with this, we enter the final 6, the endgame.
Steve, what are you doing?
I'm eating Fun Dip.
Steve came into the season with the plan that, if he made it to the endgame, he would try to win the final 6, final 4, and final 3 HOHs. Steve had done a careful job of winning only when he needed/wanted to in order to progress his game, and had been throwing most of the prior competitions. He admitted that he oftentimes found it difficult to throw a competition he knew he could win, but he was able to stick to it and get to the final 6 following this strategy. But now that he was there, all bets were off. He started off strong and won the final 6 HOH, where he finally decided that it was time to take a shot at the Oz twins. Figuring that Julia was the least likely to win the veto, he kept her off the block and nominated Liz and Austin, which became pretty awkward. Steve had done too good of a job managing his threat level and maintaining his relationships with everyone to the point that Liz was totally caught off guard and felt betrayed when she was nominated, even though it was the pretty obvious move. After Vanessa's incredible quick thinking at the veto, she was able to get both Julia and, in turn, Austin completely confused and therefore ruined their plan to get Julia to win the veto, and Austin won instead. He took himself off the block, and Steve nominated Julia as a replacement. While on the show, it was shown that Johnny Mac and Vanessa evicted Julia over Liz because that's what the twins had asked for. The real reason was that Julia was such an easy beat at the end, and they didn't want to leave that temptation there for Julia to be taken to the final 2, which would therefore decrease their chances of making it there themselves. With Julia heading out the door, we enter the final 5, and once again, Vanessa was able to win HOH for the 4th time this summer, and was looking for a reason to nominate Austin and Liz. However, Steve wasn't able to give a good enough reason to Vanessa, and she instead found it safer to nominate Steve and Johnny Mac.
So you understand it's simply it.
So you don't need to worry.
I'm the one on the block, you're HOH, why are you the one bawling your eyes out? I'm hoping this isn't just some play to get me to feel bad for her and take attention for what was actually going on.
This definitely wasn't great for Steve's game, but once again, Steve felt entirely safe. Johnny Mac was the target, and even if he came off the block, Steve knew that he would have Johnny Mac's vote to stay, and due to his carefully constructed relationship with Vanessa, he knew he'd also have her tiebreaker vote. Steve was aware that Vanessa was willing to backdoor Austin in week 5, so Steve strategically was comfortable with bringing Austin and Liz this close to the end because he'd already seen signs of Vanessa willing to send Austin home, and felt that she would take the shot at Austin if he was sitting next to Steve, especially since Liz was still in the game. When you look at it, Steve entered the final 5 in a position where he could have been sitting next to anyone on the block and was almost guaranteed to stay, which is really impressive considering that Steve wasn't a GOAT. Steve did try to win this veto, but lost to Johnny Mac. But Steve knew in the end it didn't matter too much because he once again knew the logical move for the people with the power would be to keep him in the house. So when Johnny Mac was able to win the veto and Austin went up in his place, Steve felt good knowing that Austin was going to be blindsided. And sure enough...
Sorry, Austin, I vote to evict you.
Austin,
I'm sorry, Ben.
You are evicted.
I'm sorry, I gotta do it
from the Big Brother house.
Good luck, Austin.
Good luck, Austin. Continuing on with his plan to win all of the HOHs in the endgame, Steve narrowly won the final 4 HOH by the skin of his teeth by accidentally writing down the wrong number for the tiebreaker question, whereas had he wrote down the number he meant to, he would have lost. But a win's a win, and with that, Steve guaranteed his spot on finale night. Final 4 nominations don't mean anything, so he kept Liv safe, just for fun. Going into the last veto of the summer, I'm going to have to go with what Steve has said post-game. He doesn't remember his thought process at the time. He thinks he may have thrown it, but he may not have. It looks like in the moment he was just very overwhelmed by everything and threw it, knowing that he was already safe. In hindsight, he probably shouldn't have thrown it, but at the end of the day, he ended up winning the game, so I won't really dock too many points here. Vanessa was able to beat Johnny Mac in the comp and struck a legitimate final 2 deal with Liz. Unfortunately for me and for the rest of America, this meant that it was the true end to Johnny Mac, and she went back on her alliance with Steve and John and evicted him. But with that, we're at the final 3. In Vanessa's head, she thought that she was a lock to win the game now. She'd either win the final HOH, or Liz would win and take her, or Steve would win and also take her. But Steve wasn't going to bring her.
I like my spot right now. I'm pretty sure they'll bring me to final 2. I need to make sure that Liz and Steve both feel great about our relationship so that they take me, as they're supposed to final 2 if they win the HOH.
It'd be foolish for me to go to the end with someone who's so great at quite literally everything in this game. I think if I'm sitting next to Liz and I can take credit for getting Vanessa out, I think that could be a huge step in me winning the jury votes against Liz.
And that's what proves to me that Steve is genuinely a great player. Not just because he wasn't going to take her, but because he was able to convince her that he was going to take her, and she fully believed it at this time. Steve was Vanessa's blind spot, and he always was. Steve had successfully outsmarted the poker player the entire season into thinking that she controlled him, and because of that, he was the only person to survive Vanessa's reign of terror, and he wasn't even one of her close allies in the beginning of the game. That displays excellent awareness and threat management. Back at the final 3 though, going into part 1 of the final HOH, Steve obviously wanted to win it, but realized he had a better chance in part 2, and that's exactly what happened. He lost part 1 to Vanessa, but was able to beat Liz in part 2 to advance to part 3. Going into finale night, Steve shaved his facial hair as a way to show that Vanessa didn't actually control him, and it was him playing his part as Vanessa's minion. Vanessa is a great strategic player. Honestly, one of the best ever, but her social game was the opposite. She didn't take the time to know these house guests the way that Steve did. Vanessa did the talking, while Steve would do the listening. Because of this, Steve was much better prepared for part 3, and it showed. But this part 3 was still a showdown, and it came down to this last question. In the past, I have said that Vanessa lost Big Brother 17 basically to a coin flip. But I'm retracting that statement now. In that last question about Johnny Mac, Steve has said he knew the answer 100% because he took the time to get to know Johnny Mac as a friend, while Vanessa didn't, and she saw everything as a game relationship to push herself further towards the end. So she put herself in a position to have to guess at that last answer, while Steve had prepared and knew it 100%.
Let's
the
hear
best
what...
thing about being in the house was not having to drill people's nasty teeth.
And congratulations, Steve. You are the final.
With that, Steve won the final HOH and was finally able to take the shot at Vanessa and evict her. Many people discredit this by saying, well, duh, he made the obvious move. But while you're in that house, it's not obvious. Remember, Liz was gonna take Vanessa to the end. Steve's overall awareness in that house is something I've only seen from very few Big Brother players. It's obvious to us on the outside, but to the players in the house, it's not nearly as cut and dry. But Steve made the correct decision and sat down in the final 2 chairs against Liz.
Austin, what say you now?
I'm very happy to see that Steve made an excellent decision here.
The best part is that Steve was still playing strategically here. He never told Liz that he would bring her to the end, so she was completely unprepared with her final 2 speech and jury answers, which is just another advantage for Steve. And speaking of the final 2 questions, Steve killed it. He laid out everything he had accomplished, walked through this whole game, and convincingly explained why he should be the winner. He had the competitions, he had the strategic acumen, and he had the move to top it all off. He got out Vanessa. And the jury was excited to vote for Steve. Like I mentioned before, had Vanessa gone to the end against Steve, she'd likely win. Although I do think it would be closer than people expect, myself included. But the people voting for Vanessa wouldn't be that happy about it. They'd do it because they know that she played the hell out of the game, strategically.
It was like chewing nails trying to pretend to be Vanessa's best friend. It was tough. Backstabs, betrayal. I'm all for it. But you know what? You could have had me put shoes on when I walk out that stage. It would have made no difference. Yeah, I am going to be bitter about that.
But with Steve versus Liz, the jurors were happy to see that their friend Steve had made it to the end and could vote for him, knowing he had played a great game. Vanessa voted bitterly against Steve and gave Liz her vote. And obviously, Austin and Julia voted for Liz. But later on in life, after Austin and Liz broke up, Austin apologized to Steve for not voting for him, for what it's worth. But other than those guaranteed Liz votes and Vanessa's bitter vote, that was it. Steve got every other vote and won in a convincing 6-3 vote to become the winner of Big Brother 17, the superfans' dream.
Jackie's vote goes to... Congratulations, Steve! You're the winner of Big Brother! Come on out.
To close this journey out, let me say this. This is not an anti-Vanessa video. However, after doing my research and actually looking at Steve's game individually, I think it's a huge disservice to say that Steve robbed Vanessa of the win, even though I'm guilty of saying a similar sentiment in the past. Vanessa's great strategic gameplay should not cancel out Steve's equally deserving all-around playstyle. Going into the house, Steve saw a strong strategic powerhouse in Vanessa. Knowing that she was this huge roadblock in Steve's way of getting to the end, Steve was the only player to figure out how to beat her. You couldn't outmuscle her, you couldn't outtalk her, you couldn't outcontrol her, and you couldn't even backdoor her. Many players learned that the hard way, but Steve was the only player to look at the situation, recognize what he had to do, and play into Vanessa's game as opposed to trying to take her out while tricking her into thinking that she had full control over him. Johnny Mac also had this to a similar degree, but didn't play it as well as Steve did. And it's not that Steve only did this with Vanessa. Steve did this with everyone. He positioned himself in the house extremely well, starting around week 3, and was never, ever going to be in danger of going home, no matter what side won power. Steve was in a position where he didn't need to win competitions to progress his game, and also felt safe anytime he was nominated. He could throw comp after comp with the knowledge that he was always going to be taken deeper into the game, all the while doing work behind the scenes to ensure that eventually he would be in a position where he just needed to win one comp over Vanessa in order to take her out. Steve genuinely was never in danger of going home until it got down to around the Final Four, but it didn't matter at that point, as he was the favorite to win the HOH competitions at the end due to his knowledge of the game and the other house guests. When you compare Steve to Vanessa, I've come to this conclusion. Looking at the 3 pillars of gameplay, being physical, social, and strategic, I would give Vanessa a 9.5 on the strategy and a 9.25 on the physical side. Very high marks, and I don't think you could argue against that too much. But I wouldn't put Steve too far behind. I'd give Steve a 7.5 or an 8 on the strategy and an 8 on the physical side, as Steve's overall comp win percentage when he was trying to win is actually insanely high, and the only times he lost when he was trying that I can think of were the first battle of the block, the week 3 crapshoot HOH, and the final 5 veto. So overall, I do have Vanessa higher than Steve on those 2 pillars. But once we get to the social aspect, the tables turn. I would give Steve a solid 6.5 or a 7, because although he was able to form really, really great social bonds with players, Steve's beginning strategy was to hang out by himself a lot and appear as a bit of a loner oddball, so this lower rating really is just due to Steve's strategy. But with Vanessa, I would give her like a 3. She was not the easiest to get along with, she had a very overpowering demeanor, and would get very upset with you if you didn't agree with her. Luckily, her strategic game was able to compensate for that, but I think Steve was a better, well-rounded player than Vanessa, even though she excelled in certain categories over Steve. Overall, do I think Steve is a top 5 winner? No, probably not. However, especially after doing all of this research, I think that Steve was the best in this season at doing 3 things. He was the best at managing his threat level throughout the entirety of the game. He had the best level of awareness in the house, especially post-jury, and he had the best positioning. He perfectly played the role of, don't waste an HOH taking me out, even though as we saw, it wouldn't have been a waste. But he got everyone else to think that, and that's expert gameplay. It's true that Steve did make some mistakes. He probably shouldn't have thrown that Final Four veto if that's what he did. He also didn't have spot-on reads 100% of the time, but it's important to remember that Vanessa didn't either. I feel people don't remember Steve's game all too well and simply can resort to, oh, he just skated by all the way until the end when he won a few comps and robbed Vanessa of the win. Whether that's because Steve was massively underedited in the show, or because Vanessa's game definitely had a more overpowering presence during the season, it makes sense that the intricacies of Steve's game aren't the most well known. But I hope I was able to inform you of some of those today.
Knock, don't ring.
I was feeling really vulnerable after my HOH raid because I wasn't sure if I had made the right decision with Jackie. I've solidified my alliance with Austin and the Twins more. I have my other alliance with John, so I'm definitely feeling a lot better now than I did immediately after my HOH reign.
With these winner videos, I want to start giving them a rating out of 10 on how good of a winning game they played. Not that this number is the end-all be-all of them as a player, but it just gives me some sort of basis and allows me to constrict everything down to a consistent point scale. I didn't give Josh a rating when I did the last one, and as much as I would love to give him a 10, I'm really going to give Josh a generous 4 for being below average but showing signs of awareness and being the only house guest to successfully do anything against Paul in Big Brother 19. With Steve, though, I'm conflicted. I don't want to rate him too high, but at the same time, I don't see too many faults in the game that he played. I'm very tempted to give Steve an 8, but I think I'm going to go with a 7.5, because even though Steve's positioning really was incredible, he was nominated 5 times. It's a high 7.5 though for what it's worth. Overall, Steve did have to play one of the more complex games that's been played in recent memory. It wasn't just winning out and having control of everything. And it wasn't just skating by and hoping for the best. Almost every action and every decision that Steve made was calculated and done with a purpose. Whether that being as big as who to nominate or as small as not shaving, nothing was an accident. Except winning that double eviction HOH. But hey, accidents happen. And luckily for Steve, that was a very happy accident. Thanks for watching. And of course, here's a clip for you on your way out. Also subscribe.
Nothing happened with that last week.
What do you mean? The one whose whole purpose was to get me out this week.
That conversation happened this week.
This week? Do you not know why I'm even mad? Do you not even know what I know?
No, I missed that part.
No, but that's a pretty important part.
Vanessa's a very intimidating person. She's in my face. She's putting me on the spot. My brain just freezes. I can't even remember what happened 5 minutes ago right now, let alone what happened a week ago.
This could be a $500,000 decision.
Yes.
Are you ready?
No.
Too bad, we're on live TV.